So let's go ahead and get started. I am Jessica Danielson. I am one of the faculty in the counselor education program at NDSU. I'm also our clinic director and a licensed counselor and certified supervisor in North Dakota. I have clinical experience predominantly in inpatient settings, but I also do have some experience in community-based settings and college campuses as well. So that's a little bit about me. I do have a slight disclaimer today. So we're going to talk about cultivating a resilient campus together. And I'm not sure that we can actually have a conversation about creating a resilient campus together without this being somewhat of an actual interaction with each other. So there will be points where I ask for you all to pipe in and give some ideas and suggestions. You're welcome to use the chat box. However, I would really appreciate it if you would also just engage verbally in the dialogue as well. But you are an autonomous human being, so please feel free to do whatever makes most sense to you. It would help if I clicked on it. So today, in our short time together, I'd like us to be able to define resiliency and identify some of the key characteristics of someone who's engaging in resiliency or who is resilient. I'd also like to explore practices to cultivate resiliency on campus. So this might include in classrooms with students, in individual meetings with students, but this might also include the interactions that you have with colleagues, interactions that you have with administration, those types of things. And then I'd like for us to spend some time to just brainstorm ways that you can actually implement this, because I think that when we're talking about practices, I can give you thousands of ideas, but that's not really helpful if you don't know how to implement them, or if it doesn't quite make sense on how to implement it in your individual area. And at any time, feel free to just ask questions as well. So let's start there. What comes to mind when you think of resiliency? So just one word, maybe two. All right, so grit, flexible, perseverance, grit, surviving, creative problem solving, that's a good one. Coming back from something difficult. Yeah, no, those are all really great examples. Coping of what resiliency is, or what being resilient is. So similar to what everyone is saying when you think about resiliency or being resilient, resiliency is something that we're all born with naturally. And so some of us might have different ways of being resilient naturally versus other ways we might have to learn to be resilient, but we all have it within us when we're born. And we can cultivate more of it as we go through life as needed. So it really is just the ability to recover from setbacks. So like everyone said, it's this idea of being able to cope with stressful situations, to be able to handle or problem solve difficult obstacles or opportunities in your life. Part of resiliency really is a mindset. And when I talk about it being a mindset, what I'm talking about is that it's this idea of, if you have a resilient mindset, you're someone who sees challenges more as opportunities versus just something that's in the way or something that might be difficult to overcome. You're really just using it as an opportunity to maybe use a different skill set or to develop something new. It might seem like someone who is seeking solutions. It could be somebody who is really curious in their mindset, so asks a lot of questions, wants to get more context related to what the quote problem might be. It's also this mindset of believing in adaptability, so believing that you can adapt, but also situations can be adapted. And then there's also an error in this mindset of being compassionate with other people, but also being self-compassionate, which I think is sometimes the hard part of resiliency, is being able to switch that compassion from other people, but to ourselves as well. And then having this mindset that one of the only things that we can really rely on in life that is always a truth is that change is inevitable. And so when you have that mindset, you get a little bit more of that adaptability, you get a little bit more of that ability to cope with things that are changing all the time. So it really is a mindset as well. And then as I hinted at earlier when I was talking about it's something that we're born with naturally, resiliency is often really uneven. So you can be resilient in one area of your life and have that going really, like a really strong skill set to be resilient in that area. But then in another area, you might need to be working on that a little bit more. You might need to cultivate that a little bit more. So for example, in my personal life, I'm really resilient professionally. There's not a lot of things that really like shock me. I'm really good with going with the, like rolling with the punches, as they say. And part of that might be my counseling background. But personally, I've definitely had to cultivate more resiliency, specifically around balancing my different roles. So like balancing being a spouse, balancing being a daughter, balancing having friends, balancing a professional life that has a lot of demands. So having to develop and cultivate a little bit more resiliency in that area of my life. So it can be really uneven, and just like keeping that in mind as we think about resiliency, especially on a college campus with ourselves, our colleagues, and our students, that everybody is going to have a different set of skills when we're talking about resiliency, and different skills in different areas too. So one student might be really resilient in interpersonal, so like relationships, and maybe they just academically aren't performing very well and they don't have as much resiliency. It's really helpful for us to know, because then we can really talk about what we need to cultivate there. Like, what do you actually need for support academically versus if interpersonally you're doing really great. So when you're thinking about resiliency, I think it's really helpful to think about this idea of being buoyant. So buoyancy. So when our physical bodies are pushed underwater, they instinctively rise back up to the surface. So that's the idea of resiliency. No matter how much pressure there is pushing down, if you have resiliency, you'll keep coming back up. You'll keep floating back up to the top. Any initial questions? So I don't think we really get to talk about resiliency without also talking about stress, because stress is really one of the main things that we're trying to be resilient with. This is one of the things that we're trying to cope with, and stress can manifest in a lot of different ways, which, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, in a few moments, I'm going to ask you what kind of stressors there are. But just to give you a little bit of context around what stress is a really typical experience in everyday life. You can have small stressors and you can have big stressors. So for example, a small stressor for me today, which could be a big stressor for somebody else, is that I had a dentist appointment at 7:30 this morning. And so that was a stressor in my life today. Versus a bigger stressor is that, let me think about something that's a bigger stressor happening right now. So not right now, but in the foreseeable future, one of the bigger stressors that I'm looking at is doing an overhaul on all of our programmatic paperwork. And so you have big stressors and you have small stressors, but they're happening every day, like all the time. Usually when we're talking about stress, it's short-term and situational. So in both those examples that I just gave you, both of them are in fact very much so short-term. Like I went to the dentist at 7:30 and I was done at 9:30. It's a very short-term, very situational. I got out of there alive and no harm done. So very much so short-term and situational. And even in the example of like this future-orientated stress, that's also very much so situational. Once that paperwork is done and it's been overhauled, then that stress will dissipate. So that's one of the key markers of stress, is that it has to be short-term and it has to be situational. So you might know if you're experiencing stress, if you have any irritability, muscle tension, maybe you have more like headaches, some kind of digestion concerns, maybe you have more perspiration, increased heart rate. For example, when I went to the dentist, they did take my blood pressure and it was slightly risen. And I was like, of course, because I'm at the dentist. So that was a physical representation of me experiencing some level of acute stress. You might also experience dizziness, changes in sleep. So this could be sleeping more, sleeping less, having more disruptions in your sleep, changes in appetite, which could be, again, having a decrease in your appetite or maybe even an increase in your appetite. And sometimes you might not notice that subtle change, but you might notice the difference in how your clothes are fitting, or maybe the number that you're seeing on the scale if you weigh yourself. Or you might even experience some changes in concentration. So maybe having a difficult time following conversations, or a difficult time focusing on a task for long periods of time, or maybe even just like focusing at all. So those are some of the side effects or the physical representations that you might experience when you're experiencing stress. Stress is often associated with being really problematic. However, stress is actually a survival technique for us. So it really does save our lives. When we're in danger, so we're in a stressful situation, that the stress kicks in our adrenaline, so that way we can move more quickly and we can hopefully dodge whatever that harmful trigger was that we think it is. So having this daily level of stress in these like really kind of incremental processes is actually really helpful for us. Like, this is how we often achieve things or accomplish things. Like, if I feel stressed out about my to-do list, hopefully what will happen if I have like an appropriate level of stress is that I'm going to do something off of my to-do list, and then that harm has now been dodged. However, stress can be problematic sometimes too if you have too much of it, or if it's maybe leaning more into something that's mental health related, then it can have bigger implications for that. So I like to think of it as like a smoke detector. If you are in a building with a smoke detector that works the way that it's supposed to, the alarm only goes off when there's actually a fire happening or actually smoke happening, versus if you have a smoke detector that's malfunctioning, it might go off all of the time and tell you that there's an emergency or a crisis all the time, or it might not go off when there's actually a fire. So those are times, those would be examples of outliers of when stress isn't particularly helpful to us. But when our smoke detectors are working the way that they're supposed to, stress is actually really helpful to us, and it helps us achieve and stay motivated to do the things that we need to do. Are there any questions about stress and resiliency to this point? All right, so what current prominent stressors are there for yourself, colleagues, and students on campus? So uncertainty, yes. Mass confusion. And along with mass confusion, one of the things that I brainstormed before this session was actually transitioning back to campus post COVID-19, post pandemic. Work, school, life balance, technology, anxiety, constant change, finances. Yes, that would be impacting probably all of the groups listed here. Related to finance, on my list, I also put budgets from staff and faculty viewpoints. I also put mental health concerns. So whether that be for ourselves, our colleagues, or students, but just various mental health concerns like depression, anxiety, maybe even things that are perceived as more detrimental. So like substance use disorders, mood disorders, things like that. I also, for at least NDSU, I had included diversity and inclusion concerns. There's been a lot of conversations on campus related to diversity and inclusion, and I think that definitely adds some level of stress to different populations and different people. Any other prominent stressors that you can think of? Employment. Yeah, so when we're thinking about these stressors that have been identified, they're pretty big. And there's also really no foreseeable outcome or solution to these really big concerns or problems that we're identifying. So they really do just result in some of this stress. So that's why resiliency is so important, especially when we're talking about our identity as a campus. So people who are really interdependent on each other. And so when we're talking about resilience and how to actually cultivate resilience on a campus, here are 5 tenets to suggest in order to be cultivating resilience. So like I said earlier, resiliency is really uneven. So some of these areas, yourself, your department, your students might already have a lot of, and so maybe it would be worth spending more time looking at these other areas, or maybe you get to just like look at them all and say, hey, we're not really like focusing on any of these 5 things. So we could probably do some work on any of them. So I'll tell you a little bit about each one of these tenets first, and then I would like us to have some dialogue about ways that you might be able to implement some resiliency in these areas specific to what you're doing on campus. So first we have build connections. So this is prioritizing relationships. So thinking more about how you can actually have relationships with people. I know that that's been a challenge, or maybe not even a challenge, but like different in the era of a pandemic where we don't get to have that face-to-face relationship. Instead, we're talking about how can we have relationships in more of an electronic virtual kind of world. But you'll want to prioritize relationships, focusing on those. So sometimes that might include like joining a group. So an example of this, in the fall this year, I had just an open invite to all of our counselor education students, regardless of their program, where I just asked them if they wanted to join an informal book group. And so it was totally voluntary. They didn't have to do it. And I actually had a decent amount of students. I think I had about 15 students agree to do it. And so we just like read this book over the course of the semester, and we checked in about every 3 or 4 weeks and had dialogues about it. The book was related to a counseling topic. So the title was Me and White Supremacy. And so we talked a lot about racism, and we talked a lot about disparities in the counseling relationships, but that was a way to create some of that connection for them, not just in a classroom setting, but also in an informal, personal way. So that might be an example of how you could create some kind of group, but building connections. So this could be contacting students individually, or contacting and reaching out to colleagues individually just to check in with them, but prioritizing those relationships. Up next is fostering wellness. So this is really just taking care of yourself. So taking care of yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So maybe you are trying to incorporate some kind of movement. It doesn't have to be a vigorous exercise routine by any means, but just like maybe setting a timer and saying like, okay, every hour I'm going to get up and actually just take a lap around the building once, and then I'll come back and do more work. Or maybe it's setting goals to drink water. They can be small things. They don't have to be giant things, but just like taking care of yourself. This could include mindfulness practices, or even just like avoiding negative outlets. So for example, maybe you've noticed that you've had a lot more caffeine than you normally would, and so you're experiencing some negative side effects from that. So maybe it's having that coming to Jesus, air quotes there, with a conversation with yourself and saying like, okay, maybe I don't need 10 cups of coffee a day. Like maybe I can just drink 5. And so maybe it's avoiding some of those negative outlets as well. So just overall taking care of yourself. And then you can also be encouraging your colleagues or even your students to be taking care of themselves. So an example of this is I'll be teaching the Counseling Children and Adolescents course this summer. And one of my assignments is actually for them to play. So just like go out and play for 30 minutes, whether that be a board game, whether that be coloring or playing with Legos, just like go play for 30 minutes and just like take care of yourself in that way. So we as faculty and staff can be encouraging students to be engaging in some of that self-care as well. Next is finding purpose. So this is helping others, so encouraging some kind of like community service in a way. So it doesn't have to be actually the community, but in ways that people can help other people. Being proactive towards goals. So an example of this might be having students set personal and professional goals at the beginning of the semester and then having them check in at the end of the semester, or even doing that for ourselves. So that way we can remember what the goals are and start to work towards them to give us a little bit of that certainty in our lives. Promoting self-discovery can also be really helpful to help us find purpose. Next is embrace healthy thoughts. So I want to be really clear here, because whenever I talk about embracing healthy thoughts, I think that gets really correlated with positivity, and positivity can be really toxic. So I'm not talking about positivity here. I'm talking more about like perspective taking and accepting change, and even like learning from the past. So an example of this would be this fall, I will be instructing practicum, and I had the students that will be coming into our practicum, I had them this last fall in a content-based class, and they were really struggling. And so I caught myself this spring thinking to myself, oh, practicum is going to be so hard. And then I had to really like encourage myself to take some perspective and say, okay, hold up, like these individuals will have had an entire year to like grow and to change and to learn. So that's not really maybe a reasonable perspective to be taking. Like, can I walk in this a little bit more cautiously? Sure. But I also don't have a lot of merit to me being like, oh, I think this is going to be a terrible practicum section. Like, that's not really reasonable, because they've had a lot of time to grow and they've had a lot of different experiences in 12 months. And so just taking some of that perspective. And then the last one on here is seeking help. So seeking help can mean a lot of different things. It can mean seeking formal mental health services, so going to a counselor. It could be seeking help for resources, or it could even be just like seeking help from a colleague on a task, or helping a student complete a task, or whatever that might be. But those are the 5 areas. So when you think of these, and we won't go area by area, so you can just like shout out whatever ideas you have, but how can you incorporate these 5 things into your current campus role? Save summer travel. So one of the things that I do in terms of building connections that I think really helps with student resiliency is when I'm advising, or even when I have individual meetings with our students, I talk about my experience as a grad student to help normalize and really empathize that, like, yeah, being a counseling graduate student is hard. Like, there's a lot of things that you have to balance. There's a lot of time that you're trying to like figure out. There's a lot of finances that go into this. And so I try to just like share some of my experience with them in order to help model resiliency, but also just to, like I said, normalize and empathize. Like, yeah, sometimes it sucks being a graduate student. Like, I don't have any like really great words of wisdom there. It just sucks sometimes. Yeah, a lot. Like, I think that, Stacey, I think that you're right. Like, I think when we think about resiliency, or even think about doing things to change, we get really caught up in big things. But really, a lot of this is just talking about like small daily things. Like, I sometimes, since I have a very sedentary job, I'll sometimes park further away, just so that way I have to force myself to walk. So I get a little bit more movement, or I'll take the stairs instead of the elevator, just so that way I have more of that movement. So it can be just these small things. Yeah, so like allowing time for students to be students and people to be people. So just getting that time to connect and chit chat and check in with each other before you start to do some work Okay. I've also found we also teach 3-hour block classes in counselor ed. And so during breaks, I will actually turn on music for them to just like listen to and kind of like have a change of pace. I mean, not all the students stay in the classroom, but for those that do, so that way it creates a little bit of a different atmosphere. I'll move on just because I know that we are running out of time because 30 minutes goes really quickly. This is just some resources that are available to you. So if you have students that are struggling, they can go to the NDSU Counseling Center for free. And they do have counselors 12 months out of the year. So even during the summer months, they do have counselors, so students can go there. If you are NDSU staff or faculty, know that we do have the Village EAP, and here's the information for that. And they'll set you up with a counselor as well. And then I just included some links for brief readings if you're interested on hearing more about resiliency, how to build it, also how to specifically do that in relation to students and campuses. Also, I'll put in a plug, if you're not comfortable using the Village EAP, you're also welcome to go to any community-based agency. And if you would like a specific referral and you would like help with that, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to help navigate that process as well. And these are my references. And then also on the last slide here is just my contact information. So my email address is jessica.danielson.1@NDSU. So if you'd like a copy of this presentation, or if you'd like a referral or have any just general questions, you're welcome to contact me. So with our remaining less than 2 minutes, are there any questions that you have about resiliency and how to apply this, or stress, or general questions too?
Jessica, I have a question. Do you have any readings you recommend? Like if there was a book or an article or something, like read this one. This is a good one. What would it be?
I don't have, specifically on resiliency, I don't have any specific recommendation for adults. But I do really like, and I did put it on my reference page, the resiliency for children and adult and teens. That's a really great one. And it does put resiliency into perspective even as an adult. But it is more tailored to applying it for K through 12 age people. But I haven't seen a lot of books on resiliency tailored to adults. Hold on. Let me think about that for a second. I actually do have, this is such a counselor thing. Like you asked me in long enough, I'll definitely have a book on it. I have the Little Book of Resilience by Cheryl Rickman. And it's a super easy read. I've actually known treatment agencies who give this book to all of the people who go through their programming as like a graduation gift. So it's kind of like a, what do they call that? Like a end table book, like a coffee table book. So it's super easy. There's no chapters. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, thank you all for sharing this time with me. And I hope you have a good rest of the virtual conference.